father came to New Zealand in 1951. He had married my New Zealand mother in London, and he came here on the Strathmore, which was a passenger boat. So he didn't come as a DP, and he didn't go to Pahiatua camp. He was in the Free Polish Army who demobbed in England, and because he met my New Zealand mother there, they decided to come to New Zealand. My father was born in 1919, and in 1918 the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk gave Western Belarus and Western Ukraine to the Polish and the German Empire. Prior to that, it had belonged to the Russian Empire. As a consequence, my father was a Polish citizen, even though this was Belarus. But Belarus didn't really exist as an entity. It was being shuttled between two powers. When the Russians had come in because of a secret pact between Stalin and Hitler, which gave Western Belarus to the Soviets, he was asked by the Soviet army, or the Soviet spies, I suppose, to inform on a neighbour. And he refused. He was sent to Siberia, to a gulag. And he remained there for about 9 months, we think, until there was an incident at the gulag and he feared for his life and he fled. And my father, I estimated, fled via forests and farms and country ways, because that's how he said he did, 5,000 kilometres, and found himself westward on the Belarusian-Lithuanian border. There he hid, but eventually he found himself at a farm that was owned by two elderly Lithuanian people, and their son had been sent to the gulags, and so he started helping them out on their farm. However, by 1941, the Soviets started sniffing around because they were now at war with the Germans, and the parents went into the administration people and said, "Oh, our son's returned." And so my father assumed the name of this son, and we have no idea who these people were. But unfortunately for my father, the son was called up for the Soviet army. And so therefore my father was enlisted in the Soviet army as this other person. And so he, in June 1941, was in the Battle of Leningrad. He was captured by the Germans, and for 7 months he ended up in prisoner of war camps, and we don't know which ones. However, we do know that the last camp that he was in Belarus. It was northwest of Minsk, the capital, and it was in a camp called Molodechna. And Molodechna was a starvation labour camp. So that meant that they went to that camp to work to help the Germans, but at the same time they weren't fed. And my father talked about having to be very careful what you ate, because if you ate grass on an empty stomach and you were starving, it can kill you. Anyhow, somehow, and of course there were all sorts of networks that worked then, his mother found out that he was in Molodechna, and she came and she bribed a guard, and he was able to escape from Molodechna, and he made his way home to the village of Ferbashina, which is where he was born, and he just took up normal life again. There were people looting farms, there were people burning villages. They needed somebody to have law and order, so he was called in to do that. He married his first wife, and in time they had a small child. Unfortunately, they missed. And as a result of that, he could no longer be a policeman. He was no longer safe to be anything. And so he fled to the forests, and there he became a Belarusian partisan. So my father was in deep trouble because, according to Soviet Order 270, deserters or collaborators, people who were in the Soviet army who had been captured by Germans, should not be alive. They should have shot every German in sight and then killed themselves. So if you were still alive, and especially if you were in the Belarusian police because the Germans had assigned you that job, then you were a collaborator. And as a collaborator, you could be shot on the spot, and on top of it, members of your family could be persecuted. So he knew that this was hanging over his head. And so in 1943, as the Soviets started advancing and they could hear the guns in the distance, the Germans obviously started to retreat, and so did many Belarusians who were afraid of the Soviets coming in and what was going to happen. As my father said, I lived under Hitler and I lived under Stalin, and they were much the same. He said, we went to a French farm and I don't know whether they were stealing chickens or eggs, but the French farmer caught them at gunpoint and handed them in to the local police. The local police thought that they were Germans because they were wearing funny uniforms. Well, the uniforms were the uniforms of the Belarusian police. So they weren't quite German, but they didn't recognise them. But they had Polish citizenship papers on them. And as a result, they realised that they were Polish and there was a free Polish army in the West. So they had a choice. You either go to a DP camp or you can join the Polish army. And they decided that there was still a war on, that they had a duty to fight the Nazis. They knew they couldn't go home, and they thought, we'll join the army, because if the Poles can free Poland, we might have a hope of Belarus being free. So he spent 1944 and 1945 serving in Italy and Egypt, and he trained up to be a tank driver. So at the end of the war, this is the European War, they were still sitting in Italy because they were told that the next thing is that they were going to be sent to Japan to fight the Japanese. My father said he was actually rather relieved to hear that the war with Japan was finished. It was a sigh of relief for him. It was a very long war for him. He became part of the Polish resettlement plan. They were in a camp at Whitley for a couple of years where they were taught English, where they were given, I suppose, all the support that the Pahiatua camp would have given people here, but for a longer period. And then he went to live in London, where he worked as a tailor, because that was actually his trade. And he worked for Harrods and for Aquascutum, so he worked at, quite high-class establishments. And it was while he was in London that he met my mother. They met very romantically. He was needing a flat and had seen an advert, and she was shifting out of that flat. And it was a foggy night. My father arrived with some tiny little suitcase, and my mother was struggling down the stairs with a great big heavy suitcase that she brought from New Zealand, and he asked if he could help her. And so he carried the suitcase all the way to her new place. However, my mother remembers that he struck off into the fog, walking really quickly, and she had a moment of doubt where she wondered whether this man was just going to walk off with all her possessions. But no, he dutifully went to her new abode, and after that they started going out with each other. My parents came to New Zealand separately. They had booked on the Rangatiki, But 2 days before they were due to leave, they found out that because my father had alien status, he wasn't allowed to sail through Suez because he was regarded as some sort of political liability. So he waited a little time, I think it was only a matter of weeks, and he came on the Strathmore, which went through Panama. Then they went to Wellington, and they lived in Wellington for 9 months, and my father worked as a tailor. I have no idea what my mother did. But my grandmother, by that stage, my New Zealand grandmother, had shifted to Palmerston North in about 1949. And my father started tailoring in Palmerston North, and he had a tailoring business in Coles Buildings, which was next door to the railway, which was at that time running through Palmerston North. And indeed, I was born when they lived in Coles Buildings. They shifted to Keeling Street, and then very soon after, my father discovered that tailoring in Palmerston North wasn't going to work, that people by then were buying their clothes off the peg or in the department store. In 1952, he joined the post office, and he worked in the main post office in Palmerston North Square, and he worked there all his working life, and he absolutely loved it. It suited his social outlook, it suited his ability to talk to people, to know what was going on. So it wasn't long before the DP community worked out that my father worked at the post office, and actually he was quite multilingual. So he would be called to the counter, and people would ask for letters, and sure enough they were in cannot find or lost. I guess I became aware that our family was different from Kiwi families around us at a very young age. For 2 reasons: my name, because I'm Tanya Kopytko, and that's 2 foreign names, so I wasn't a Lucy or a Mary, I was a Tanya. And while Tanya's popular now in New Zealand, it wasn't when I was a kid. Nobody was called Tanya. And then on top of it, I had an unpronounceable and unspellable surname. The second reason that I noticed that our family was different was from early on, because I would say that there was tension in our family. I would say that on my mother's side of the family, there were definitely family members and my grandmother who were not happy that my mother had married a foreigner. And so you sense that as a child, that not everything is easy and that you're a bit different. The third reason that I would see that life was different was that there was Cold War prejudice, and I did feel that. At College Street School, I remember children saying to me, "Oh, you're a commie." And I went home to Dad and I said, "What's a commie?" And he got so angry. You know, he always brought us up to be strong. You have to stand on your own feet. That awareness of being different was definitely there, and I definitely had a foot in 2 cultures. My father had a major effect on my life because my mother died when I was 10, and I lived with my father, and so there was the 2 of us. So from a very young age, I was very independent, and Dad and I got on. And I think that Dad just made sure that I was the same sort of survivor that he was. Education was terribly important, and as an only child, they made sure I learnt ballet, that I learnt music. As far as they were concerned, they wanted me to be a music teacher because that was a good independent job for a young woman. They wanted me to be independent, to be able to travel if I wanted to, and have some job I could do anywhere. But I chose to do dance. That dance I loved. And I had to have tutus, and I went into the ballet competitions, and my father made my first tutu. And not a surprise, my father was a dancer, my mother loved ballroom dancing. They both loved dancing, they just didn't think it was a very safe career. I've managed to work in the arts and dance all my life, and in the end I think he was quite proud of that. Had to go to Massey. There was no choice. You had to do a degree. And why did I study anthropology? I think it was in order to try and understand who I was and how cultures work. From the research that I've read so far, that the children of the refugees or the DPs that came here after World War II, on the whole, I think have done very well. They've gone to university, they've felt confident, they've contributed a lot. So, you know, if New Zealand had a policy that it wanted to bring skilled labour to New Zealand, it brought skilled labour to New Zealand, but that brought even more skilled labour to New Zealand. The other thing about my father was that he was deeply spiritual and he was orthodox. We had an army barracks hut at the back of our garden in Linton Street that came from Linton Army Camp and was my playhouse when we shifted there in about 1957. They were going to turn the playhouse into a small chapel. Initially I thought it was a joke, but no, they were serious. And so they did. And we had the chapel of the Archangel Michael in the back garden. And it had icons. It was just small, but gosh, it gathered the community together. And they would talk and eat afterwards. Everybody brought food. They all went into the house. They'd be there for hours talking. And my father loved it. I feel definitely richer from understanding two cultures. I guess the way I've been brought up is that I can see the cracks in things. I can see prejudice and I can sense an injustice. And I'm very pleased to say that most of my working life I've tried hard to help people in those situations. A lot of Kiwis don't understand this whole era of immigration that happened. And it was an assimilation policy, and I think that in revealing the stories, we can explain the diversity of things in Europe, the different things that people went through, and I think it makes New Zealand culture richer to understand that we're all not the same. My dad came first. He came on the 2nd of May 1951 on the first voyage of the Goya. A year earlier, he had actually left his home country of Romania for Greece because he had Greek citizenship. He lived in Greece for almost a year, but because Greece was recovering from the civil war, there was hundreds and thousands of people who were unemployed. So he couldn't find work. He lived in refugee accommodation, and at various stages he had to apply for relief so he could buy food. The reason why my father left Romania was because Romania was occupied by Soviet troops in 1944 and became a satellite state of the Soviet Union. My father refused to become a member of the Communist Party, and as a result, he could not be employed by anybody. My mother arrived in Fremantle in November 1952 aboard the infamous ship, the Corsica. From there she was flown to Wellington, and she came because the people she loved the most were all dead and felt that there was no future for her in Greece. Now, my mother's family survived, as she constantly told me, we survived the Italian and the German invasion in World War II, but we didn't survive the Civil War.
She witnessed the shooting of her brother and her mother, and she was critically wounded. She was traumatised for the rest of her life. The people who had committed these horrendous acts, not only towards my mother's family but to other families in the village, returned to live in the village. There were no trials, nothing was held. My mother refused to live in the village, so she felt like she was a displaced person in her own country. My father was on the Russian front because Romania had sided with Nazi Germany, so they invaded Russia. He very rarely spoke about the war, and Mum used to say to us, there are things he doesn't want to remember. And he just refused to think about it, talk about it in the end. They were quite happy to come to New Zealand because they were told that the people here were friendly. So they packed their bags, their battered suitcases. Mum arrived in New Zealand after being married to my father for a few days. And she had spent a year in Greece with a mother-in-law that she didn't know, but she brought her over, looked after her. I was reading in my father's paper, he spent 28 days there. They didn't talk much about the camp. Dad was sent to the state forest, and he stayed there until my mother arrived, and he applied to actually get moved to Palmerston North when she arrived. The rest of his family was here. When the Zambazos arrived, they were split up. My uncle was sent to Lawrence, Dad was sent to Rotorua, and my aunt was sent to Palmerston North. They intentionally wanted to split people up and have them work in areas where there were jobs. I think they may also have not wanted to create little enclaves of particular nationalities, which is quite sad actually, because a lot of these people didn't really want to be away from their families. They learnt to speak a smattering of English when they arrived, but they were constantly learning. They taught themselves to read and write in English. They just found life a struggle. They lived from hand to mouth for a long time. There was very little money for anything, any luxuries. Dad worked as a labourer, started off as a labourer, and eventually moved to JJ Niven Engineering. And from there he moved to Massey University where he became a janitor. He had his own commercial cleaning business in the evening where, along with Mum, he cleaned commercial buildings and pubs. So they both worked really hard. They were people who didn't want to rely on charity. They had a lot of pride. How people saw them mattered. And they didn't want to be seen as these poor refugees. We spoke Greek at home, and as soon as we left the house, my sisters and I would start speaking English. And it remained so even after I left home. As soon as you step in the door, we greeted our parents in Greek. We ate food that was totally different from other people. Meat was stuffed with garlic and had rich tomato sauces. Mum would cook risottos that were tomato-based. She'd cook eggplants and capsicums. We would have tzatziki with our lamb. So it was a totally different culinary experience. The teachers at primary school made us feel different. And I still have vivid memories of being told by one of my teachers when I was about 7 or 8, I bet you can't wait to get married and change your name to Andrews. And I was totally horrified. How dare she? And as a result, I've never changed my surname, and I've given both my daughters the name Zambazos as a middle name. I mentioned earlier that we lived from hand to mouth for a really long time, and that was a big difference between that we noticed with the kids at school and ourselves. I remember wearing hand-me-downs that were even too small. Education was pushed really hard, and it was a way of making our way in the world and having a better life than our parents. So Mum and Dad supported both my older sister and myself to go to university and make a good living. My mother especially taught us girls to be independent and to rely on ourselves. I sewed, I didn't cook, but it was important for her that I have a job and that I could support myself without having to rely on a husband. I grew up with feet in two worlds, the Kiwi world and the Greek world. And as a teenager, it was difficult because I wanted to be like my Kiwi friends. My parents, though, worried that I'd turn into someone they didn't understand, so there was always conflict. It was only as an adult that it became easier because I picked what I wanted from each culture and what suited me, and I was comfortable with that. It taught me to look at other people who were different and to accept them for what they were, and to be very aware that their backgrounds made them the people they were. They read the paper every night, and they would show us a sentence and we'd read it to them and say, this word means this. And I think because they did that almost every night, their English really improved. There was no way you were going to fail. I had become used to the fact that if I didn't have a good education, I wasn't going to get ahead in life. I saw how hard my parents worked and how little they made. The war had interrupted education for them. When the war broke out, the schools closed down in Greece. So that was my mother's education finished at primary school. And she valued education. She wanted to go to high school. They were always proud of us. And Mum regularly would tell us that. Mum was a gardener, beautiful flower garden. And whatever she planted grew. Just one of those people. And I hope I've inherited her love of gardening. And she sewed beautifully. My mother kept in contact with her sister-in-law. My father, in the early days, would talk about his cousins because they were quite close. But as the years went on, he stopped talking about what was back in Romania for him, and they were just resigned to the fact that they were never going to return. With Romania, there was very little communication. My older sister in the 70s went and visited my father's family, and they were delightful, wanted to know what was happening. But with the communist government, it was hard to write anything that wasn't going to be redacted. I'm a Kiwi Greek. My father was an ethnic Greek. He was born in Romania, but his mother was born in Eastern Thrace, which was Greek. His father was an ethnic Greek as well. They spoke Romanian because they lived there, but they had Greek citizenship. The displaced people's story isn't widely known. John Balasoglu's book, Travels of My Family, is now out of print, and that's the only story that I have read. It's important to tell their stories because these people left their homelands often in traumatic circumstances. And once they arrived here, they put their heads down, they worked hard, and they contributed to New Zealand society. And because they valued education so much, a majority of their children were tertiary educated, and they in turn contributed to society here, and many are still contributing.
My family came to New Zealand in 1950. My father, his name was Felix Petrenas, became Felix Petrenas. He was born in Kruanis on 17th of December 1919. My mother, she was from Wagenfeld, Germany, and she was born on the 24th of April 1927. I found that I'd lost 6 uncles and 2 aunties through the Second World War. Being in Germany, my father surrendered to the Americans, so he was in a prisoner of war camp and then a displaced persons camp. But Germany was an ash can, and it had been completely destroyed in the Second World War. Once they got married, my mother lost her nationality and she became a displaced person just like my father did. And I think being displaced persons, then my parents wondered where they fitted in that part of the world. And I know that my father worked at a joinery factory at a place called Groß-Ippener, which was in the middle of Germany. They looked at where their future might expand. And I think when New Zealand was looking for refugees or displaced persons to come to New Zealand, that's when they applied to come to New Zealand, to a better life. They left Bremerhaven on the 5th of September 1950. That was after a 2-month bureaucratic delay, and you can just imagine how difficult that might have been, having sort of come from a displaced persons camp, having to wait an extra 2 months before leaving to travel on the Hellenic Prince all the way to New Zealand. 18,000 kilometre journey all the way through the Red Sea and around Australia, and they arrived in Wellington on the 19th of December 1950. From there they went by rail to the Pahiatua camp and then came to Palmerston North, where my father was working at the Manawatū joinery in Joseph Street. Both my parents got naturalised Kiwi citizens in 1962. When I went to school at the age of 5, all I understood was German. I went to a Lady Lewis school in Palmerston North where the nuns were pretty adamant that, I'd better learn English pretty quickly. So I did. A lot of people did have trouble saying the Petrenas name. After a while, I think the actual realised how it should be pronounced Petrenas rather than Petrenas or Petrenas, and I got plenty of different versions of that. In fact, As I grew up, I found it quite fascinating that sometimes I would answer the phone and the person at the other end of the phone would say, "You can speak English." Yes, that's correct. Either that, or if you rang up and said who you were, that's the first thing they would ask, "Can you speak English?" So it was very interesting to sort of have such a name that people wondered who or where you fitted in, because when you look at the name, it doesn't sound very Polish or anything else, and it's quite interesting to sort of get people's impressions. I was called Bruno Petrenas when I was born. A lot of people say to me, "Well, that's your nickname, so what's your real name?" So I keep telling them that it is Bruno Petrenas. My father, having grown up on a farm, he was very self-sufficient, so he was very resilient. So when we moved to Cook Street in Palmerston North, he had a very extensive garden of cabbages and potatoes and tomatoes, and we had a chicken run, so he was very self-sufficient. So when Christmas came along, my mother was pretty good at cooking and baking, and we used to have quite extensive chicken soup and other meals like that, which are European based. My father used to like rye bread rather than the white bread because that's what he grew up on. At Christmas time, we always used to have Christmas on Christmas Eve, and the presents were dished out at Christmas Eve, and then you'd go to midnight mass. So that was our tradition in recognising Christmas and also recognising Easter time. So Easter time, well, my father used to be out there sort of hiding Easter eggs around the actual tomato plants, so that you have to go hunting for the Easter eggs. They were real eggs rather than the chocolate eggs you get today. My father's career, well, he went to technical college in Europe to learn joinery and cabinet making, and that's why he was employed at the Manawatū joinery factory in Joseph Street. The quality of his work was superb, to the degree that you could just about say his work was of an artisan sort of quality work. And that's why even today, even though he died over 42 years ago, there are a lot of products, furniture and houses that he built still available to be looked at today in Palmerston North. So his heritage has hung in there all that time. And I mean, say I have furniture at home which is over 70 years old and it's good as the day it was built. So he was an expert at that sort of work, and he really knew how to do things with wood. He would go to, there used to be a place called Ozolins down Rangatiki Street, and he used to spend a few hours there sorting through the different types of timbers that were available for furniture making. Very hard to find that today, because in those days you could still get totra, rimu, and all the native timbers that were available for furniture making. Like I say, he was an expert at that work. My mother was a very good dressmaker, and her heritage is reflected in the number of wedding dresses that she made for a lot of women in Palmerston North. She was also a very good cook and did a lot of preserves, especially with peaches and everything else that you might get from orchards and all the rest of it. So again, it was a reflection of how you had to become very resilient during the war to survive. My mother made most of my clothes and my sister's clothes, and she did a lot of work for the different guilds at the church, helping out people in clothing wear. I was the only child then for around about 7 years until my sister was born, but I would go home and I think my parents enjoyed me trying to tell them a bit about English, because they would have learnt basic English at the Pahiatua camp. And you know, they had little notebooks, and I've still got a copy of that notebook where they've tried to write in English different words and what they meant. So it was a two-way street. I used to listen to what I had to do at home in German, but at the same time I would give feedback to my parents saying what certain words in English meant. At Christmas time we were always together, mainly because the family never got a car until I was about 21 years of age, so really we went everywhere by bike. So we travelled around Palmerston North by bike, down to the Esplanade, to the Memorial Park, to the swimming holes on bike. My father was very quiet and very silent about it. Like I sort of say, when he was in the barracks in 1939 and the Russians came in, the Russians basically sent all his family off to Siberia, and they were never seen again. And so he always thought about them, always remembered their names, but he never spoke about them. He spoke about being a shepherd out there in the field and the wolves coming to get the sheep and all the rest of it, but I'm pretty certain he did miss them, but he never knew or ever found out whatever happened to them, which was quite sad. And even up until he died, he never found out what happened to him. And he was absolutely paranoid about anybody trying to write to Lithuania using the Petrenas name, for fear that the KGB of Russia would then track anybody down and sort of say there was a Petrenas in New Zealand and sort of impact on them. On my mother's side, my mother was very emotional at Christmas time and would think of all her family back in Germany, and she did have the opportunity to go back to Germany about 3 years before she died, and she met all of her relations in Germany, but she couldn't wait to get back to New Zealand because New Zealand had now become her home.
My father came to New Zealand on the 13th of August 1951. Zalyo Matev Mihailof, or as he was called in New Zealand, John Mihailof, was born in a little village, Elhovo village, in Bulgaria, in central Bulgaria. So he was the eldest of two boys. He had a brother, Mihail, father Miti Mihailof, and his mother, Donna Ivanova Toneva. They lived on a farm. He had a very happy rural village upbringing, completed 7 years of schooling, became a shoemaker, and when he was 19, he was conscripted into the Bulgarian, at that stage it was the socialist, the communist army. His life then altered. Between the years of 1946 and 1949, there were a series of circumstances and events that led to my father deserting the army and fleeing Bulgaria. Those circumstances were, with the new socialist communist government, the farms were collectivised. Farmers had to fulfil the quotas for export. It left people hungry. Very few goods were available. Life was compromised to how it had been before. Their beliefs, their religious beliefs, their way of living, very compromised. The Mihailovs were also members of the Bulgarian Agrarian National Union, the BANU, which had been formed in the late 1800s. When communism came, members of the BANU were persecuted. Zalyo's father was imprisoned for a year because of his involvement with the union. The union was very strong. It later became a political party as well. So my father, being a member, also feared that he would be persecuted as well. Also at the same time, my father had had an arranged marriage to increase the family's landholding. It was a very unhappy marriage for my father. So he was married to Penka. They had a young son, Mitko, a very unwell son who subsequently died when he was nearly 3 years old. So while my father was in the army, his son was unwell. Dad requested leave to visit his son and it was denied. So all of these circumstances around what was happening at that time, my father made that decision then. He was going to desert the army and he was going to leave Bulgaria. In August 1949, my father and two of his friends escaped from the army. They were based in the Pirin Mountains, which are on the western side, close to Sofia. There's a mountain range, and across from that is the Yugoslavian border. They took their guns. Unfortunately, they took the wrong ammunition. Eventually, they made it to the border. There was a fog that had descended, which was going to act as a camouflage for them to escape across. They were challenged by a guard. Because of the wrong ammunition, they weren't able to defend themselves. My father was the only one who managed to escape. His two friends were shot. So that then was his destiny. He couldn't go back. It was an act punishable by hanging for desertion of the army. That was it. He was gone. He'd left his home country. From that, my father would have been labelled as a bit of an agitator, and he was then sent to a forced labour camp, Monastir it was called, and that was very close to the Greek border. Again, terrible conditions. He secretly escaped from that camp and he made his way into Greece. In the Lavrian camp, my father was deemed to be a suitable applicant. He was young, he was fit, he was healthy, he was single, he could not go back to his home country. So he was screened for collaboration charges, his identity was verified, he was given the medical checks, he was interviewed, and he was advised by an official that New Zealand was a good place to consider emigrating to. It was a young, developing country. My dad passed all of that, and on the 13th of August 1951, he arrived in New Zealand aboard the SS Goya. It was the second sailing of that boat in that year, and he arrived to start his new life. When he arrived, he went to the Pahiatua camp. He was there for 6 weeks, where they were given the intensive language courses and given an overview of life in New Zealand, in democratic New Zealand. In 1950, the assimilation policy that New Zealand had meant that you became a New Zealander. You took on the British ideals and the way of life that we had here. You left your culture behind. And my dad, with a past and knowing that he couldn't go back, he would have been very happy to be assimilated into this new, welcoming country. But as we found out through the years, you can't give up your culture. You can't give up what is inherently part of you. After the Pahiatua camp, he was given 2 years of bonded work down in Waitaki with the hydro dam, and his job there was to help extend the powerhouse. They had to stay there for the 2 years. They had their alien cards. They had to report to the police if they were going to go anywhere else or change their address. And then after his 2 years, he went to Timaru. In Timaru, he was befriended by Emmanuel and Katie Caldas, Greek immigrants. Emmanuel had his own fish and chip shop in Timaru. Emmanuel and Katie later became my godparents, so they were very dear friends of my father. Dad bought his own house in Timaru and he bought his own fish and chip shop in Timaru. He was a young, handsome, dark-haired, olive-skinned young man. He had offers from the Greek community down there to find a bride for him, but Dad refused that. He wanted to meet a New Zealand woman, so any children that he had would be raised as New Zealanders. In 1958, he met my mother, Tony. She was English with Maori descent, and she was very attracted to this foreign man. My father was very attracted to her. She was tall. He wanted to meet a tall New Zealander, so his children would be taller than him. So in 1959 they married. For some reason, which I'm unsure of, they left Timaru and came to Palmerston North. That may have been because of Dad's memories of being in Pahiatua. It was a familiar area to him. It looked at buying a chicken farm, but instead settled on the Central Fish Supply, a fish shop in Featherston Street, where he operated the same business that he'd had in Timaru, wet fish and fish and chips. I had been born at that time. My brother, Michael, had been born. Father had saved enough money by that stage to buy his own home, which was 31 Lombard Street. And that was his home for the rest of his life. 2 more children were born. There was Peter and then there was Suzanne. After selling the fish shop, Dad worked in the Longburn freezing works for a time, and then he worked for steel equipment. He became a fitter welder, new skills for him. Dad stayed in that job for all of his working career until he was 65. He was very well respected in his job. Dad was a man who worked with his hands. He was a very hard worker. He was strong. His job was to manufacture the farm equipment, but his job also was to train the apprentices. He was a very cheerful man, very welcoming. Our friends were always welcomed in our house, and my dad became a second father for some of our friends. The earliest difference was when I became aware of our name. Our surname was always mispronounced and always spelt in multiple ways. It was really only as I became older when we would have friends to stay, or then I would go and stay at my friends' houses, I became aware, and comments were made in a positive way. It was never in a negative way. Oh, your father's got a really strong accent, which Dad did. He had a very heavy Eastern European accent, a lovely accent, I thought. He looked a bit different. He had olive skin, very dark hair, looked a bit different. Our diet was different. We had been introduced to foods that my dad had grown up with. So we had salami and we had olives and pickled vegetables. The Watson Brothers delicatessen in Palmerston North, the deli counter would be with people speaking other languages, looking different. At home we played traditional Bulgarian music, which has a very unusual beat to it. That was played when we had parties or gatherings. Or my father would play it when he was feeling a bit nostalgic as well. Another difference was our backyard was a garden. It was my father's pride and joy. His vegetable garden, his grapevine, beautifully, organically grown vegetables set out beautifully in rows. And it wasn't until I went back to Bulgaria myself and visited our family farm there and saw the way things were set out. And what my dad had done was replicated in a smaller fashion what he had remembered from home. Another very noticeable difference was our main socialising group. They were with other Eastern European families within Palmerston North or from Wellington as well. And these people were different from my New Zealand friends. They were quite loud, they were colourful, these social occasions were filled with music and dancing and lots of drinking, lots of eating, different languages being spoken, very colourful occasions. My father also started doing something that was illegal at the time, which was distilling his own rakia, or he called it his white lightning. Rakia is a national drink of Bulgaria. It is distilled from seasonal fruits. Fruits are fermented and then they are put through a still, and you are left with a very potent, clear liquid. So our garage was filled with buckets in fruit time, peaches, plums, kiwi fruit, fermenting in buckets, and then behind closed doors the still would be brought out. My brother was a plumber, he helped Dad fashion the copper piping, and Dad would distill his own white lightning. Another difference that I was very aware of was my father received eventually, after some time, letters from Bulgaria, and these beautiful letters would arrive in these very soft envelopes with this funny writing. We spoke English at home. Dad didn't speak Bulgarian. It was only really when he was socialising with people that he felt comfortable with that he would speak in his language. Dad would write back to his family. My dad spoke very good English. He was successful, he ran his own business, but his written English was not good. And so my mother and I would be helping Dad whenever he had to fill out forms or he needed to write letters in English. And that was different to my New Zealand friends. Dad had a very traditional outlook on life. The gender roles were very divided. There was the conflict there as years went on because my mother was younger than my father, and as time went on, her ideals in life were changing. She was embracing more modern ways of living, wanting to work, wanting to travel and to do things. That was not what my father wanted at all. My father had had those years of restlessness and turmoil. He was very happy to be settled in Lombard Street. This was his safe haven. He had made it to this place and he wasn't going to be leaving. So that did cause conflict, and eventually my mother did leave the marriage because of those differences. In 2017, my brother Michael passed away. After that, I decided I would put my DNA and get that tested. And in 2019, we discovered that we have a half-brother, Neil Mitchell, who lives in Australia. So Neil was from a relationship in 1955, prior to meeting my mother, that my father had had. So I lost a brother and then I gained another one. I'm so grateful to have these two cultures, well actually three cultures, because I have my mother's Maori culture as well, as part of me. The connection to Bulgaria is actually very strong for me. When I've been back there, there is an immediate connection to the land, to the people, to my family. It's been brought alive by the stories, the languages from my father. So I feel very enriched by that. There's also the acceptance of other cultures, the empathy towards difference and people from other cultures. It was the highlight of his life. In 1989, the communist government was overthrown in Bulgaria, and in 1990, he went back to Bulgaria with my brother Peter and my sister Suzanne. In 1981, when I was overseas, I had made inquiries to go over to Bulgaria to visit my family, and the embassy told me not to go. They couldn't safeguard me because of the circumstances of my father's desertion. So I'm sure when my father went back in 1990, despite the fact that the communist government were no longer in power, there would have been this core in him that would be, is something going to happen? His mother was still alive, 89, nearly blind, always believed that her son would return to Bulgaria. And what a trip that must have been, to reconnect with his family, the land, the farm that they still had. His first wife, Penka, was still alive. He made a trip to see her. Dad had always, I think, struggled with the two cultures, never fitting in with either, almost like a chip on his shoulder, not feeling good enough, I think, at times in New Zealand. And I think this trip for him cemented his Europeanness. This is a story to pass on to my children and my grandchildren. It's to know and embrace your whakapapa is so important. It's the foundation for your identity, for your sense of self. You need to know your connection to the lands and to the people that you come from.
This story is about very, very close family friends, and we're talking about somebody who became my aunt. The people we're talking about is Lucy and Martin's Ozolins, who came from Latvia, and Martin's brother-in-law, Nikolai Zvaizna, who also came with them. They were older DPs to come to New Zealand. Lucy was born in 1909, which means that when they came over to New Zealand, they were in their 40s. So Lucy and her husband farmed in a place called Aberley, which was near the Daugava River in Latvia. And she had married him at age 17, and she was a proud farmer's wife. And she always told me that a good farmer's wife knew how to do everything, to sew, to weave, to embroider, and to make a good home. And indeed, she could do all of those things. They had one son, and everything was fine. They had a happy family. And then the Germans invaded in 1941. And the Germans, or the Nazis, requisitioned all the farms in Latvia and said that the people had to now grow food for the German country and for the soldiers. And they were given slave labourers who were Russian or Soviet prisoners of war. And they were slave labourers because they were given strict instructions that they were not to feed these prisoners of war. And she would say, of course we fed them, but we had to be very, very careful, because if they were seen to be fed, we could be shot. But that act of taking slave labourers from the Soviets was seen as a collaboration with the Nazis. So they were in a dangerous position. In April 1944, their son, at age 17, was taken with 4,000 other young Latvian men to work in Germany. And he was given a job to refuel bomber planes. So it was dangerous work. These young boys had to run out onto the runway, refuel a plane, and it'd be off going again. And he was way over in Western Germany, so a long way away from them. And then the Soviets started advancing, and it was clear that they had to go. And the Germans were retreating from that western side of Europe. And so they ended up walking through Poland to northern Germany. And they ended up in 1946 in camps in northern Germany that were run by the Germans. And then you can tell by their records that the Allies were then in Germany, and their documents changed from German to English. And so here they were in October 1949 in the British zone without having shifted very far, and they were in Bochum camp. And this was a displaced persons camp, and it was actually run by the Lutheran Church. There were a lot of Latvians that fled because basically the Soviet Union wanted their country. Many fled because, of course, they knew that the Soviets would shoot them. Lucy had two brothers. One committed suicide and the other one was sent to Siberia and never heard of again. So they were in these camps for quite a long time, and one can see from their records that they were very industrious people. And Lucy put all her skills as a sewer into practice. And there are papers that we've got. She says that she's a trustworthy woman, and so she could be given a sewing machine for the purposes of sewing clothing for people in the camp. And we also know from the papers that Martins was a driver and could also do woodwork. He was a good farming man and he could do most things, and so he became a driver in the camp. And this was very, very important because it showed that they were reliable people, they were honest people, and they knew they had to get out. So Lucy sewed clothes and people were very grateful. I remember there was a beautiful old aluminium mug sitting on top of her fridge, definitely in Latvian design. And she told me that a family had come in with blankets and fabric and they wanted her to make clothes for the family. They were desperate. And she made coats and everything with the sewing machine in the camp. And then the father presented her with this mug that he'd made by hand, all riveted metal, and it was made from downed warplanes. So it's made from aluminium, beautifully riveted, and the red jewels in this mug are made from the plastic lights of the plane. And she didn't really want to talk too much about the war, but I did manage to get that story out of her. So they came to New Zealand in 1950 on the Hellenic Prince. So they were stuck in camps for quite a long time. They actually wanted to go to Canada or Australia because they knew that there were other Latvian people that were living in Australia or in Canada, but they were told that they had to go to New Zealand, and they weren't too sure where New Zealand was except for it was near Australia, and they knew some Ozolins that were going to go to Australia, so I guess they must have hoped that maybe they would see some family again. So they arrived on the Hellenic Prince and they were dutifully taken to Pahiatua camp. Now, they'd never spoken English in their life before, and we're talking about people in their 40s. It's much more difficult for older people, to acclimatise, to learn a new culture. But they learnt English on the Hellenic Prince, and from what we understand, that ship was relatively well organised. It had lots of clubs and social organisations on it, even though the people came from many, many different cultures. She also was given a sewing machine on the Hellenic Prince, and there is another certificate to say that she volunteered to sew for people on the ship and help them with clothing and made clothing and such like. So they arrived and they went to the Pahiatua camp, and they were given another 6 weeks of English language training, and then, as was the policy, the government starts to look around for work for them. And they, by 1951, were in Palmerston North, so they didn't move very far. They went to live in Palmerston North, and Lucy worked at Manawatū Canvas, first of all, in 1951, then Jagard Hosiery that same year, and then in 53, she changed to the Manawatū knitting mills, and she was there for a long time. She told me that in order to improve her English, she would write English words on the cuffs of her blouses, and she would try and remember and read the words while she was sewing. She also said that if it wasn't for their neighbours, they never would have learnt English so well. So they had Kiwi neighbours who were awfully kind to them all their life. They were older than them, and they gave them English lessons, they helped them, and they eventually bought a house in 48 Albert Street, which they lived until their end of their days. And Nikolai Zvaizna, the brother-in-law, he had also left Latvia at a slightly different time, but in the rush, he lost his wife. He lost contact with her. So he came out to New Zealand and he lived with Lucy and Martins as a family unit. No child, the child was in Germany, the son ended up back in Latvia. How he survived the war after being in Germany, we don't know. But she never saw him again. He died, and at that stage he was living in Moscow. She applied to go to his funeral, and because my father and myself helped her get her visa to go, we know the dreadful situation that she was put through in the 70s when her son died, and the Soviet Union obviously was wanting to make it difficult for outsiders and people that shouldn't be living as far as they were concerned. She was treated dreadfully. She was an elderly woman, and I can say that she was strip searched. For what reason, we don't know, other than just to behave in that manner. For them, 48 Albert Street became a little piece of Latvia. Martins, who was very good with his hands and who worked for Ozolins, and so did Nikolai, would collect offcuts of this, that and the other, and gradually the little old house that was in bad repair got turned into something wonderful that when you walked into it didn't feel like a Kiwi house. It had some other feel to it. And Lucy set about with her spinning wheel, with her loom, and with her embroideries to fill it with cushions and beautiful covers that were all in Latvian design. Somebody in Australia was an accomplished Latvian painter and painted scenes of the Latvian forest in autumn and summer. They had a large back garden, they had ducks, they had chickens, they had an apple orchard, they had pears. She was a keen member of the apiary clubs. They were naturalised in 1965. They decided as soon as they could that they would settle in here, and they made some life that was between Kiwi life and Latvian life. And she continued to absolutely improve her English, so that as I grew up, because I knew her from a child, they were close friends of my parents, she'd be wanting to talk about Freud or anthropology, and she would be reading textbooks, and I would give her my Massey textbooks and she would read them, and I would go there at lunchtime just to say hello, and it was very hard to get away because she wanted to discuss this philosophical statement or that philosophical statement. So from a person in her 40s that didn't speak English and was, as she said, a farmer's wife, but a very intelligent woman, she really tried hard to make her life as interesting as possible. She loved arts and culture. She would go to concerts with us, and she loved storytelling. She'd go to anything that, opera, you know, Russian concerts. She didn't feel bad about it. She was like my father. She said, you separate the politics from the culture. The culture is beautiful. The politics is not. So in the end, her husband had a stroke and he died in 1966. And so Lucy lived with her brother-in-law, Nikolai. They just lived together as companions. And she lived until 1984. And all the time she collected and bought things to send parcels home to Latvia. She wrote letters to her son. She organised for him to receive a piano accordion because he loved music. He sent her back a composition with all the music and all the words written in Latvian. And I remember that she sat there reading the words and listening to the tune, and it was like that moment she was with her son, the son that she would never ever see again, and I know that she loved him dearly. When they died, they had decided that they would be buried in Wanganui. I asked her, why do you want to be buried in Wanganui? And she said, when I look at the Wanganui River, it looks like the Daugava River that flowed past our farm. And when I look at the soil in Wanganui, it's the river soil that is like the soil of the Daugava River. And so therefore, I want to be buried there. And that's their story.
Dad arrived 1st of May 1951, age 19, accompanied with his mother. Jetta was her name. They came on the Goya, the first of the 3 voyages of the Goya to New Zealand that year, filled with refugees. They set off from Piraeus in Greece. Dad and his mother had been there for about 15 months after exiting Romania, where Dad was brought up. They left because at that stage it was about 1949 and Dad was due to finish his apprenticeship, and the Romanian government was rounding up the apprentices who had just finished and going to send them all to Siberia, the worst possible place to go. And she smelt a rat and made arrangements to gather documents, what was necessary to exit Romania. They lived in Romania in Brela, which is on the Danube. Dad's father was a captain of a vessel that carried grain and benzene, and he vanished about 1944. At the time Dad was 13 years old. They think that he was driving a benzene tanker, a water vessel, and they think that it was mined from river mines. 5 years after that, late 1949, they left Romania from the port of Constanța and arrived in Athens, where they stayed in refugee accommodation, and later on the island of Syros, anywhere that they could get jobs. He was a newly minted joiner and he was seeking joinery jobs. In those days people had all their furniture redone every year, repolished, and that's what Dad was trained to do. And he lived with the family. They would recommend him on to somebody else and he would go and do their furniture. Later he got a job in Athens in a workshop business, but that was quite fraught because they had gangs of protection demanding that you pay them money, otherwise they'd smash the windows of the business. When you came to New Zealand, he said it was so easy, job-wise, occupation-wise, you didn't have that opposition. They first went to Bulgaria, on the coast of course, very close to Turkey, at a place called Artipol, and then about 1890 they shifted up to Galati, and that's a big shipbuilding port as well, and they lived in a street behind the docks. The death of his father meant the family were unprovided for and unprotected. Even though Jetta, my grandmother's side of the family, mostly looked after Dad as a child because my grandfather was always away on ships. They arrived in New Zealand on the 1st of May and they caught a train straight from the docks to the railway station at Pahiatua and then were trucked to the camp. They were there about 6 weeks, in which time they learned half a day learning to speak English and half a day learning customs and things that were different from their own New Zealand ways of life. During that time, my grandmother, Dad's mother, got married to a Bulgarian man and they left separately. They went to Taihape, but Dad went to Wanganui. He was a joiner and he was put in joiner occupation and had a friend already there. He had to stay there 2 years. I think he was bonded, but his mother and her new husband went to Taihape and he used to visit them. He had to check in with the Wanganui police station, get permission to go, By that time he had a motorbike and he was zooming over the hills to Taihape where his mother was. I think he must have requested to go to Taihape. They were short of workers everywhere in New Zealand. He had a trade. There was no French polisher in Taihape, and I think he would have got there in 1952. And they all bought a house together. My father started his own building business. So he went to Ozolins actually and set up an account, and he said we were very lucky because they didn't require payment until about 3 months later. So that was how he started. His building was so good that architects of the time would ask him to take over a project or start a project for them, because they knew that he was very detailed and good quality work. Even after he retired, architects would call him in and say, look, we've got a curved staircase against a curving wall. None of the builders around town know how to do that. Will you do it? Dad spoke without an accent. Because Dad learned, he was young, he learned the language very easily. He said it was way easier than Romanian and Greek. And he was able to, I think, leapfrog a few things that might block other people with a thicker accent. We ate food from Romania. We had stuffed peppers, and they'd have mince and rice in them, and stuffed peppers meaning capsicums, and they'd be in a bath of boiling up in a pot with tomatoes. He mixed with everyone from Romanian and Greek and anybody else who also came on the same ship who they got friendly with. His approach was to see a need and go and help meet that need. His joy came through his family, his work, and when I say family, I mean his family in Romania as well. He related well to Maori people. He felt the warmth there. My mother is half Maori. My father had his own sense of personal value and worth that wasn't beholden to what another culture thought of him.